Our love for the world around us and our passion for protecting that world can come from many different places. It can come from a connection to the land, or a magical experience we had with other people in a particular place, or a sense of awe from the beauty of the living creatures that inhabit these ecosystems. But that love and passion can also come from seeing or experiencing the destruction of this same ecological web, from pollution in the air that rains down onto a playground, or the clearing of wildlife habitat to make way for a fossil fuel pipeline. Dave Cortez has been organizing for environmental justice in Texas for the better part of 2 decades. He lives in Austin now, but the love and passion that guides him came from the Rio Grande, the Sierra Madre Mountains, and the high desert of West Texas, and from fighting a copper smelter and other threats to the land, air, and water in and around his native El Paso. Dave has a fierce love for his El Paso community, but cutting his teeth as an environmental justice organizer in his hometown wasn't easy.
2 of my close family members worked at the plant. My dad's brother worked at the plant and then worked at Chevron on the other side of town. And then his brother-in-law worked at the plant and retired. And here I was, this younger punk, sort of just not super close to the family, showing up at events and ask what I'm doing. And they think I'm a paid protester, Forget my education, forget what I'm actually saying. It's deep cultural assimilation. It's deep colonization, sort of this Stockholm syndrome that develops out of poverty and repression. It's horrific and it's sad to watch people fiercely defend the only thing that has helped them in their eyes and not be able to acknowledge the harm that's been done. It's not different from, addiction in that way, or depression.
Or domestic abuse.
Or domestic abuse, exactly. It's heartbreaking. It still hurts me to talk about.
I'm John Fiege, and this is Chrysalis. Dave Cortez is now director of the Lone Star chapter of the Sierra Club, where he's bringing his El Paso roots and years of experience on the streets and in the communities around Texas to the Sierra Club's statewide campaigns. I've known Dave for many years and used to regularly attend environmental justice meetings in Austin that he helped organize. Our conversation tracks his education as an environmental justice organizer. From the playgrounds of El Paso to the gentrifying neighborhoods of Austin, his story reflects the changing nature of the American environmental movement and the exciting possibilities of more robust connections between community-based frontline environmental justice struggles and the large and powerful environmental organizations with nationwide influence. Here is Dave Cortez. Well, you grew up in El Paso in far west Texas, and it's right on the border of Mexico and New Mexico. Can you tell me a bit about growing up there and your family and how you saw yourself in relationship to the rest of nature?
I've got a little picture I'm looking at of my very first demonstration. It's a bunch of kids meaning college kids, my age at the time, about maybe 22, 23, and a big peace flag, and we're hanging around what was called Plaza de los Lagartos, Plaza of the Alligators. And we're there, I think we were protesting, it must have been continuing invasion of Iraq and in Afghanistan. But, I keep it up and I keep pictures of the mountains of West Texas. The edge of the Rockies is what cuts into the central part of El Paso, the Franklin Mountains. And then you have the Rio Grande, the heart and soul of that land. And on the other side of the river, those mountains continue into the Sierra Madres, all the way down to the coast. It's majestic. It's, that land is as colonized as its people. The river's been dammed up upstream in New Mexico and 2 reservoirs to provide water for agriculture and farming and things like that, recreation. It was the only area of water that we had access to when I was a kid. We would drive up to Truth or Consequences and load up on night crawlers and whatever other tackle and bait, and then take my dad's car and drive along somewhere, find a good spot, and fish from the shore for a couple days at a time, camp. And, that was a desert lake. It was wild for me because we didn't have water,
So tell me about what you did.
Well, we would just go up there. That was our place to go get access to water, away from the desert. Growing up in El Paso, it's dry. It's desert. We used to average 9 inches of rain a year. It's down now, but the Rio it's always been sacred, and it was special. And it was a place you could go and see water, not all year round, but most of the year, and see it flowing. And you look in any direction away from the mountains, and you can see what feels endless, but it's actually, 2 or more 100 miles to the horizon. You see thunderheads 30, 40, sometimes 45 or 50,000 feet high, way far away. You hope maybe those might come your way. Maybe we'll get lucky and get a little bit of rain. Most times they don't. But with that, sometimes you're blessed with the outflow that carries the smell of creosote, a native plant in the region that everybody's come to call the smell of rain. And, even if you don't actually get the rain yourself, you might get some of those breezes and some of that wonderful smell. And it's life-giving. It's restorative. As a kid, I was fortunate that my family made an effort to take us out into the desert quite a bit. We would go chase storms. We would watch lightning. My father would turn the AM radio to a blank station so we could hear the lightning on the radio, the static, the pop. And we got a real kick out of that. And we'd go off-roading and find spots and park and, just hang out. And that was a pretty common thing for a lot of folks around town, was just to get out into the desert. My heart and soul and my spirit is connected to that land. It is part of that land. I draw strength from those mountains, from that river. I worry about moving further away, what that might do to me, how that might be a strain. Even just being here in Austin, 600 miles away, it feels very far. My family was middle class. I call it 80s middle class.
Mm-hmm.
And, both my parents worked. I have 2 older siblings, and we were all in public school and doing our thing. Everything seemed, like the Wonder Years kind of situation. And, you don't, when you're young, if you're fortunate, you don't see a lot of the issues around you. It wasn't until my teens, my parents split, and I was living with my mom and started to see a lot more other sides of life, some of the struggles, and just kind of notice more about the town, about culture. But it was really when I moved back to El Paso after college here in Austin at St. Edward's, where I studied political science and philosophy, environmental policy. When I moved back, it all started to come together, how much I missed, how much I was removed from about my community and my culture in my youth. So the language is the biggest example. We did not speak Spanish in my family. It was something my parents spoke to each other when they needed to talk about something that we didn't need to know about as kids.
Right.
We didn't know about our indigeneity. We weren't raised around that. We didn't know about the cultural connection to the land. I think in some way, the spirit in my family drew us towards it. We would go spend time around those things, but we didn't really have conversations about it. And the biggest thing I didn't know about was how heavily polluted and contaminated the air was growing up. I tell a story about going to middle school. This time I was in private school and Catholic school, just being out on the playground. It's a concrete schoolyard kind of situation, and you run your hand on the railing, and there's yellow chalk-like stuff, and you don't think twice about it because it's like chalk or it's dust. Well, in that part of town, downtown El Paso, it's because of the copper smelter. We had a 110-year-old lead and copper smelting operation called the Sarco that was less than 2 miles away from where I was going to school. And, you move on. Maybe you're a kid. Maybe you wash your hands. Maybe you don't. And it just, when I moved back, I thought of that. I thought of all the times I used to play in the dirt like every other kid in El Paso does. You don't got a Barton Springs to go to or a Greenbelt and Creek. You play in the dirt, you dig tunnels, and that stuff gets in you. And that's loaded with heavy metals, arsenic, cadmium, lead, you name it. It was a huge shock for me to learn that the land that I was around as a child in the air that I was around as a child was just heavily contaminated, and I knew nothing about it.
What was the experience like when you were actually in college and getting more heavily into activism? Like, what was motivating you, and how did you see yourself in relationship to other folks?
Right on. Well, I can't leave out that the reason I came to Austin was because of my older brother and my older sister. I'd never seen green like this town when I came to visit my sister in the summer. So I just was blown away. Everything was green. There was water. It rained. It felt like an oasis, and I wanted to come here. So I went to St. Ed's, which ended up being, expensive as hell, but really cool in the sense of, an opportunity to learn, to be away from home, and so I didn't really know what to make of this town when I was here. I didn't know what to make of the people, the students, but by the grace of the Creator and in serendipity, I was thrown into a class on social movements and got to study the 1960s. And so, developed a really foundational experience learning about the broader politic of American civil society in that case, which blossomed into deeper learning around political theory and rhetoric, dating all the way back to some of the Greek philosophers and modern day political thinkers. But I really got a ton of just wild information into my head. In 2006, it wasn't here in Austin. It was on North Padre Island. The Austin Sierra Club was organizing a trip. There was a woman I liked at the time, and we were fancying each other. I'm like, hey, let's go camping. And there's this, I don't know what a crawfish is, but they're doing a crawfish boil. And they say they're going to clean up the beach. So we grabbed my SUV and we went and set up, and it was awesome to be out there around all these people that we didn't know, offering us free food and beer and just, associating on this beach and that I really loved. Folks might not know, it's like 60 plus miles of primitive beach outside of Corpus Christi. But I didn't quite understand what we were really doing until the next morning, right at dawn, when I was awoken by these huge sounds of tractor trailers hauling right by the water right in front of us, just a caravan of them driving down to the other end of the beach to do gas drilling. We get out of the tent and we're watching this. And I mean, you just want to, throw something at those trucks, and go put your body in front or something. Like, what the hell's going on? And you're just watching the rubber, the plastic, you name it, just fall off these trucks. And in their wake is just a mass of debris and trash. And this is all in endangered Kemp's Ridley sea turtle habitat. It's a nesting area for the Kemp's Ridley sea turtle. And that's why we were there. And so, right after that, we all commiserated and got to work and just picked up more trash than I think, I've ever picked up. And I'm still shocked that was allowed. But that's really where I started to take a turn and understand more about how the state facilitates this destruction, the destruction of the land for the profits of a few. Shortly after that, I graduated, and that was it for my time in Austin.
So after you graduated from college, you went back to El Paso, and you became an environmental justice organizer for El Paso Acorn. And it was shortly after your time there in 2009 that the right-wing activists did a big hit job on Acorn and brought down the organization in the U.S. for the most part. And Acorn was a powerful community organizing group at its height, and it had this unique community-based organizing model. Could you talk a bit about the Acorn organizing model and how it possibly, I assume, became part of your organizing DNA?
Just like learning about the 1960s is a pillar of my praxis, the work with Acorn is right there with it. It shaped me. Maybe it's just because it's one of the first things I learned about, but it'll be with me as long as I do this work and have breath in my lungs. Some people are quick to point to that it's built out of the School of the Industrial Areas Foundation and the Saul Alinsky model of community organizing. And yeah, that's true. But, I didn't know any of that. I didn't, I was just taken in by these folks. There was a guy, recovering addict, just trying to make his money doing his canvassing while I was hanging out at a coffee shop, kind of by where I was living in El Paso University. And it was my day off, and I'm out there hanging out. And this dude, his name is Ken. I call him, Squirrely. Ken let me know how they were planning to reopen the Asarco copper smelter, the big 828 foot tall smokestack that I grew up around. And I was shocked. And that's, I studied all these things, and I was like, wow, I cannot believe that. That's right there. My mom lives over here. She works there. I live over here. And, I told them whatever I can do to help. Get more letters, spread a petition around, whatever I can do. And they invited me in to meet the team, which was a small team. And the first task they gave me was actually nothing to do with that. It was just to go distribute information about free tax prep, helping people in a really poor community not far from where I went to middle school, and which is not far from the smelter, get access to tax prep in English and Spanish. And at the time, I had a mohawk.
Nice.
I had to cover that thing up real fast. And I wore a straw cowboy hat and went door to door, knocking on people's doors, letting them know about this. And Jose Manuel, the lead organizer at the time, the director, saw me and was into it. And they offered me a job after a few days of that. And the job was doing the same thing, plus inviting people to come to a community meeting about the reopening of Asarco. So here's a way that we can help you with some, with your money, basically your bottom line. And also there's this situation happening that can affect and will affect your health and well-being, the safety of your family. At the time, I didn't realize that there was a very intentional strategy there. But that strategy is essential to the work that we do as environmentalists and climate justice activists around the country and here in Texas. People are struggling, and you got to find ways to help them directly with what they're struggling with day to day, which is often their pocketbooks. And so if you can do that, you're going to build some trust, you can build some relationships, and then you might be lucky to talk to them about another bigger, more complicated issue.
That seems to be like a really beautiful definition of the difference between environmental justice organizing and traditional environmental organizing, where environmental justice organizing, you have to start with the community and make sure everybody, you have to deal with everything. You can't just isolate an environmental issue. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I don't know where that came from. I haven't read all the books about these things, but that model that was picked up by so many organizations and NGOs is it's almost like counter-revolutionary. It's almost counterproductive.
Yeah.
Like you're intentionally trying to marginalize your base and silo it. So whatever we do, now I try to espouse that in folks. Some of the work we've done around Austin and other parts of Texas, that's the route we go. Talk about bills every time. And then, start to figure out what else is going on. with Acorn, a major flaw in the national model was that they would want to sign people up to be bank draft members.
Right.
Like you'd push a card onto them. Hey, sign this card, gives you bank info or something, and we'll sign you up, as a bank draft, so you get access to our help. And obviously, I didn't do that. And as the work evolved and we got more people canvassing and doing the work, we didn't do that either. It went against our values. Now, if there were middle class people with more means, yeah, we'd ask them to do that.
To contribute a certain amount each month.
To contribute, yeah.
Yeah.
But we also did things differently in the sense of we organized, we found, folks who were highly motivated by the issues, students, artists, residents in the nearby communities who wanted to contribute. And so, contribute their time. That theory in the Acorn model of you got to get people financially bought in to be committed, I think can be challenged. And there's lots of ways to get people plugged in. And so one other key here was, I wasn't brand new. This work wasn't brand new. There had been people fighting ASARCO before I was involved, obviously. And it had ebbed and flowed in terms of how much community opposition from just working class people was centered. There was a lot of wealthier folks, politico types, people who worked for legislators or senators or city people, academics, things like that. And there was a handful of working class people and a smattering of workers, former plant workers. So our job was really to find more just students and people in the impacted communities. But it had been going on for so long that people were really drained. Parents whose children had MS as a result of this or had other health problems, they eventually backed out because it was just too exhausting to go up against the machine of the Texas state government and go testify and struggle. And they just couldn't do it anymore. So we had to find new people and inject new life. We made it a point to work with some of the younger folks to start not really an Acorn chapter, but just a group on the UTEP campus called Students for Reform. And those kids are amazing. A couple dozen students, Chicanos for the most part, all going off to do awesome things in their lives. But for 4 years, they led the fight there on campus, challenging the administration to disclose more information and trying to represent student opposition to the reopening of the smelter.
I was looking up some articles about ASARCO. I found this one 2010 article from John Burnett, who's NPR correspondent based in Austin. So he talks about in 2009, the U.S. Justice Department announced the settlement of one of the largest environmental bankruptcies in U.S. history, in which ASARCO would pay a record $1.79 billion to settle claims for hazardous waste pollution at 80 sites, as many as 20 states, including the copper smelting operation in El Paso. And he quotes some interesting community members like an 82-year-old former maintenance worker named Miguel Beltran, who says, "You can't get a job here in El Paso compared to ASARCO. ASARCO is the best place to work. We were just like a family." And John Burnett also quotes an anti-smelter activist named Debbie Kelly, who says, they marketed it very well, and the people of El Paso were brainwashed, believed that this was the most wonderful thing El Paso could possibly have, this tall, polluting, contaminating smokestack. And this is this classic tension in environmental justice organizing. The big polluter in town is often the biggest and best paying employer as well, especially for folks with limited education. And these working folks often side with the company in some ways, and at some times kind of accepting the environmental problems for the economic opportunities. And the smokestack itself is this shining symbol of progress and prosperity that goes way back to the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. What was your experience with this tension between economic opportunity and environmental health in the organizing and how that was represented in the media?
Let's take a few cracks at it because it's a big question. I'll start with my family. Two of my close family members worked at the plant. My dad's brother worked at the plant and then worked at Chevron on the other side of town. And then his brother-in-law worked at the plant and retired. And here I was, this younger punk, sort of just not super close to the family, showing up at events and asking what I'm doing, and oh, they think I'm a paid protester. Forget my education, forget what I'm actually saying. It's deep cultural assimilation. It's deep colonization, sort of this Stockholm syndrome that develops
Right.
out of poverty and repression. It's horrific and it's sad to watch, people fiercely defend the only thing that has helped them in their eyes and not be able to acknowledge the harm that's been done. It's not different from, addiction in that way.
Right.
Or depression in that way.
Or domestic abuse. Don't talk about it.
Or domestic abuse, exactly. It's heartbreaking. It still hurts me to talk about. But, that was the case. And, that in that situation, you just try and make peace with your family. Just try, get through the gathering and you go on. And, some of my family was very supportive. They're like, yeah, that stuff's bad and we should do better. You don't get investments in the well-being of a community that, like, say, in Austin, and all this money flooding here, and STEM education being invested in, and pre-K access, and nature-based education and Montessori education, things like that. All of this is part of that conflict that pushes you to try and find the best thing you can for your family. And any of the workers that I organized alongside say the same thing. They were so proud and happy. Daniel Ariano, another sort of lead visible face against the reopening of the smelter. He's a former steel worker. He tells the story about, like, his dad worked there, his uncle, his cousins. It was just like a family thing. Like, everybody, if you could get a job at ASARCO, you knew you'd be okay. You could raise a family, maybe even your wife or your spouse, your partner wouldn't have to work. But, behind that golden gate, there was a lot of things that people weren't being told. Things like maybe you shouldn't be taking your work clothes home and washing them, right? They sent people home to wash. And that's very common in heavy industry in the 80s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. These companies do that. In Danny's case, his kids got sick, and they developed health problems, and he points to that as part of the reason. Washing his clothes in the same machine with as his kids' clothes. His wife feels guilt about that, heavy guilt.
Yeah, that's hard.
It's violating.
Yeah,
they had them. That settlement came because they. Well, in part because ASARCO was caught for illegally incinerating hazardous chemical weapons waste materials from Colorado in the smelter. And these men weren't told about it. They shoveled this stuff in there and were exposed to, not recycled waste, just direct waste from the Rocky Mountain Arsenal facility, weapons manufacturing facility, chemical weapons manufacturing facility. And that stuff was burned and they were exposed. It's infuriating. And once they learned that, and they were falling ill and they had some evidence, they tried to organize other workers, let them know, former workers, let them know what was going on. And they encountered the same thing that I encountered with my family, just like this wall of acceptance, this willful, ignorance. I don't know about that. Just like denial. And that was really hard on them. They got ostracized. They lost a lot of friends, and so they found allyship in other people whose families had been sick, in residents on the other side of the river in the colonias, whose children had been severely sick, who were bleeding every night because of bloody noses and heavy metal contamination. They found allyship with Debbie Kelly in the Kern place, which is sort of a wealthier neighborhood, the educated, more white, affluent folks who didn't want the smelter around. And that's how the Get the Lead Out coalition really came together. Was you just had these different interests aligned around this lack of justice. But the worker piece was always, and the economic piece was always, the straw that would break our back. And when ASARCO hired a PR firm, Teresa Montoya, to build their marketing campaign to reopen the smelter, that was their big thing. I want to work for ASARCO. I want to work for ASARCO. And they march out all these Chicanos and throw them in front of a plant in their hard hats and talk about the good jobs and the pay. And it's tough to compete with. I know the people in Port Arthur, in Corpus Christi, even down in Brownsville, and you name it.
Same story everywhere.
It's the same story.
Appalachia as well with the coal miners.
Absolutely. The amount of energy it takes to fight Goliath, you never have enough. You never have enough resources. You got a PR firm, and this facility was owned and run, ASARCO, Grupo Mexico, owned by Carlos Slim, at the time the wealthiest man in the world. You're never going to have enough just to stop the bad thing. How are you going to strategize and organize in a way where you're talking about building the good and replacing it with something better and taking care of these people? It's doable. It absolutely is. But at the time when you're in the suck like that, it's very hard to pivot, and it's very hard to motivate people who have resources to give you those resources, to bring on people, to pay them to do that work. It's a boxing match. Take your hits and wait for the time to throw a punch. And I think one thing that really hurt ASARCO a lot was when it came out that at their operations in Arizona, El Paso, and elsewhere in the 70s and 80s, they had been using health assessment screenings that were based on a false standard that Black men and brown men had a 15% higher lung capacity than white men. Therefore, they could work 15% longer. They could be exposed 15% more than white men. And that came out, and we had some incredible, dedicated, educated volunteers who were digging this information up, who were putting it to the news outlets. And without the news outlets putting that information out there, like the New York Times that put it out about the hazardous chemical weapons waste, we wouldn't have been able to really punch back. But that stuff came out, and then we could organize with it. We made materials out of it. We made sure everyone knew that, this is the kind of crap that this place was built on. No matter what they say now, you can't trust them.
Right. Yeah, and this another thing that John Burnett brought up in this NPR story is he quotes some longtime community members who said that when the winds were blowing to the south toward Juarez in Mexico, the smelter would crank up production and send pollution directly into Mexico, where they could do nothing to regulate it or stop it, even worse than in the U.S. And that's this pretty insidious and cynical route around U.S. environmental regulations. And American companies have this long history of sending their polluting factories and jobs overseas. But in El Paso, they could just send the pollution directly to Mexico while keeping the plant and the jobs in the U.S. Were you able to do any cross-border organizing in El Paso to combat this kind of flagrant disregard for air pollution in Mexico?
I wasn't able to myself, or it wasn't a choice I made to do myself on the broader scale. Mariana Chu, who worked at the time for the Sierra Club and as an independent activist and organizer, did a whole hell of a lot and deserves a ton of credit. Mariana and others were also able to, Aurelio Roque, were able to build relationships in the colonias and get to talk to people that were, the definition of directly impacted. Right on the other side of the river, you drive through El Paso on I-10 and you look to the left when you're passing through downtown, and it's just colonias. And that's Colonia Felipe Angeles. And some students who we'd found and became acquainted with at UTEP, and were filmmakers, and they were able to get over into the colonias and document the lived experience of some of these folks, and it's horrific. And they made a short film I'm happy to share called "The Story of Cristo," and it's just a little boy, who's like that. He's bleeding every night because he's got heavy metal contamination. He's 2 years old, and that story spread. It was similar to other families all throughout the colonia. Dirt roads, just full of metal. Not a lot that could be done unless there was funds provided for it. And part of that settlement in relation to the chemical weapons waste was that ASARCO would give money to an outfit in Mexico to pave those roads. That's it. Except no wrongdoing, no responsibility. We don't admit nothing, but here, take this and leave us alone.
Literally sweeping it under the rug. There's laying asphalt over the dust.
Absolutely. I mean, that's absolutely right. And one interesting intersection here with the colonias there was as we marched towards the end of 2007 and 2008. We're still fighting the plant. It started to become more and more dangerous, and people were less responsive and less receptive to being interviewed on camera with our comrades, and the gangs were starting to move in to the colonia, control things more, and that was that. It wasn't safe anymore. The last thing you should be doing is driving over there with a camera. And so those stories sort of drifted away, those folks, and we weren't able to really work with them a whole lot more because the narco war was starting to take root.
Because it's the same thing they do to fight you. They give your neighbor a job, and they get your neighbor working against you.
Absolutely. I mean, you're not going to go toe to toe with the same weapons. You got to find a way to find their weak spot and cut them at that weak spot. And I learned that. In this fight. We weren't scared of these people. We weren't scared of their minions. We weren't scared of the former workers who wanted the plant to open. We weren't scared of them. Everybody tried to intimidate you, but I'll start with that part first as a critical strategy. My, 23-year-old high energy Mohawk wearing self, right? Like I thought I knew it all and was ready to go, just like against that jerk down on Red River Street in Austin. And the first public meeting, debate, whatever that we helped organize, some of those workers were there outside, and they were they pick a smaller person, a woman, to argue with, and she ain't scared of them. But soon enough, there's 4 or 5 of them around her, and oh man, machismo is something all of us from the border suffer from, and that kicked in hard. You just get into it with these guys, but that is not the way. That is not the way. Arguing and fighting, especially with the people, even though they're trying to get you to do it, the people who want a job in these facilities, the community members who just want a better way for their life. You cannot let the people at the top pit us against each other. That's why it's so important to be anchored in community, talking about the nuance, how to step and where, what to look out for, and really trying to build together. It has to be at the forefront.
Isn't that the history of American industrial capitalism? That for it to work, the industrialists need to pit various groups of people against one another, whether it's along lines of race or income or religion or geography or immigration status or whatever. Like that's how it works. You need to divide people by those things so they don't get together and they don't form allegiances.
That's right. I mean, it's not something that's created by the oligarchs and the industrial capitalists and the power holders. It's something that they exploit, right? It's there. It's a wound that's already there, and
no doubt.
it's something that concerns me greatly about broader civil society and our failures to build community and relationship in brotherhood and sisterhood, in a true spirit of mutual solidarity. The more that we neglect doing that work, the easier it is for something to divide us or someone to exploit it. We see it. There's an endless amount of examples we can point to. But if you start your work in trying to build something better and build through a positive relationship, it's going to feed in the long run. It'll help you endure all of the struggles that are going to come, the conflicts, the infighting, the personality disagreements, whatever. You got to have some foundation. And I learned that from that night outside the UTEP library, arguing with these guys that, no, we gotta find a way to work with these workers. We got to really center the fact that people need work and jobs. And that's where, really started to become close with not the guys I argued with, other workers who were already disaffected, Charlie Rodriguez and Daniel Ariano and Efren Martinez and others. They became, in some ways they already were, but for my work, they became the center of what we were trying to do and focus on, that this is actually not what we want. These jobs are not the kind that we need, because look what they did to me. And so
right.
That's one piece. We've got to find a way to get people more meaningfully involved with the policies we're trying to change. So there's just a far greater number of people pushing for positive investment in something that, I'm not just like NGO staff, like the less NGO staff in those boardrooms, the better. Get everyday people in there meeting, pressing for these decisions and calling for it. And it makes it much harder for the special interests to push their own agenda.
Well, that's a good transition to Occupy Wall Street. So in 2011, Occupy Wall Street began in New York City in Zuccotti Park. And then the movement quickly spread around the world, including to Austin. And I know you were heavily involved in Occupy Austin and its campaign to get the city to divest from commercial banks. I participated in a couple of those Occupy Austin bank actions, and I don't think I'd met you yet. But as many people might remember, one of the big discussions and debates around Occupy was whether and how to organize and whether to make formal demands, which always makes me think of Frederick Douglass, who famously said, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will." But those words from Frederick Douglass were not the guiding light of many Occupy organizers and participants. I'd love to hear you talk a bit about your experience with Occupy Austin and the internal debates and conflicts about what it was and how it should operate, and what you brought away from that whole experience that you put into your organizing work after that.
Yeah, it's one of the most exciting times of my life so far. To be able to 3, 4, sometimes 5 nights a week meet up with 50 to 60 people, not at a general assembly, but a working group meeting, and everybody's there ready to, talk and break out and figure out the next step for getting people to close bank accounts and, organizing the rally and building the art and all those things. It was organic. I'm so happy that and fortunate to have that experience in this city and in this country. It was real. You see the romanticized version of uprisings in film, in writing, and on the news, in different ways around the world. This was that. At least the closest I've been to it. And it wasn't just the sign holding and petition gathering. We did all that, but it was, people were in. They sacrificed time away from whatever they had going on around them to contribute to something better. And that I've never seen an appetite so large for participating and contributing to something that can change the world. I've seen it try to be engineered a whole lot by NGOs, and it's laughable. It's
Yep.
insulting, but for me at the time, it was like a dream come true. I remember a week before Occupy launched, there was a meeting happening at Rudomaya, and the room was just full of people, and a bunch of white dudes, hippie yoga types on stage, talking about some stuff. But I'm up there front row, just like eager and just like listening. I'm like, this is great. So they opened the mic for everybody to come up and have something to say. And it was awesome. I just never seen it. I was like, wow, this is the Austin I always wanted to see. Sure enough, there was a meeting after that the next day and the next day after that. And that kind of continued on for a few days. And then there was the day of the launch, and lots of people packing City Hall. I mean, you couldn't move. There were so many people out there, and there were people talking for hours. Everybody was just willing to stay. And, I just can't believe how patient people were for weeks and just like hanging out. I think they just wanted something different, and they wanted to be part of something, like I said. Now, me, day one, I'm like, yo, if we're going to be out here, we need some data. And I got my clipboard, and my dear friend and former partner, Betsy, had been working for a group that was doing foreclosure organizing and been getting people to move their bank accounts or close their bank accounts. And so, I got some materials from her, and took out like 6 clipboards to the rally, and that was my whole shtick. Was just like, hey, y'all, we should close our corporate bank accounts, and people loved it.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That's
what
like,
drew
hey,
me
here
in.
you go. Just put your name down if you want to help out. And I mean, I filled up pages and pages of this thing. People who wanted to help out or close their bank accounts, and from that, like you'd find more people who are like, hey, I can help with that. I used to work at a bank, or I've got some time on my hands. And so it was rad because while all the noise was happening, the day-to-day that people are more familiar with Occupy Wall Street, the General Assemblies, the infighting, the conflicts with the unhoused folks and things like that, we had this parallel track of our bank action crew, which was doing, building switch kits and, trying to reach out to people to, help walk them through how to close their bank accounts and stuff like that. Or organize marches on the banks so people could go in and come out and cut their credit cards and we could all celebrate. Like that was great. That was classic organizing. If you weren't down in City Hall every day for that first month, you're missing out on something. I don't think people appreciate enough like how much work people invested into trying to maintain a space. Like maintaining a physical encampment is, the people with the most knowledge on how to operate a small little civil society is the people who've been doing it before, which is our unhoused folks, and
Right.
there was a huge class conflict that really emerged quickly that the police and the city manager and others began to exploit, by trying to bring more unhoused folks down to City Hall, allowing some to sell and distribute drugs, not enforcing any oversight. We had women attacked, and attempted assaults and things like that they were just looking the other way on because they wanted this to go away. And it was up to us to figure out how to manage that. And that really became the core of the non-bank action kind of conversations. Everybody wanted to do solidarity with everything else, but it was really about like, how do we keep this thing going and how do we maintain our presence here? Do you negotiate with the city? Who negotiates? Who's responsible? Do we just say, F you, we're not going to talk to you all? But like through all that, like some amazing friendships were developed, and I mean, like bonds, just true, real friendships. And people may not be super close anymore, but all it would take is a phone call or a text to bring people back together.
Right.
It's something I'll just value for the rest of my life.
Yeah, totally. And in 2015, the Austin Chronicle named you the best environmental activist in Austin for your work as, quote, the heart and soul of Sierra Club's Beyond Coal campaign in Central Texas. And I know you've done all kinds of work with the Sierra Club, but I wondered if you could talk about what the fight has been like to transition from dirty energy to clean energy in Texas, which of course is the oil capital of the country. And looking over the years you've been doing this work, what stands out? What have you learned from this massive campaign?
Like you said, it's Texas. We're the number one, carbon emitter in the country and a huge one in the world. And the United States cannot meet the modest to weak goals in the Paris Accords unless Texas gets its act together. And we got some real problems here, not just from fossil fuel pollution, but from industrial and toxic pollution, and just from our livelihoods. There's another story out yesterday. Are we going to have power next week because we're going to hit the peak of the summer? It's hard to think about the fight for clean energy in Texas without thinking about the power of the fossil fuel and industrial industries. There's been a battle since 2000 and 2005 to stop new power plants and advocate for clean energy. The fuel type changes. Back then it was coal, and then it was gas, and now it's like, oh my God, we just don't have enough power. How do we get it?
Mm-hmm.
But it's still the trade associations, the Association of Electric Companies of Texas, Encore, which is an electric distributor company, NRG. You go down the line, Energy Transfer Partners, all of these fossil fuel corporations making billions and billions of dollars still call the shots. They still influence and basically direct decision makers on what is going to be acceptable in terms of even discussion. You can't even get a hearing in the state legislature on flaring reduction, which is a very modest thing, because they have enough influence to make sure that conversation is not even going to happen. And their members, like Energy Transfer Partners and others, are some of the biggest donors to politicians in the state. So, why shouldn't we listen to those people? Kelsey Warren, DAPL, Dakota Access Pipeline CEO, behind Energy Transfer Partners, gave $1 million, his largest donation ever, to Governor Abbott, right immediately after the legislative session. And this is after his company made well over $1 billion. I think it's closer to $2 billion coming out of the winter storm. Energy Transfer Partners. While people died, these people decided it would make better financial sense and profit sense to go ahead and withhold supplies of gas to power plants and gas utilities and let the price go up before they would deliver that gas and therefore make a ton of money. Forget that more than, some say 200, some say 700 people died, many of them freezing to death, many of them carbon monoxide poisoning during the storm. Forget that. It's all about the money. And that's the biggest takeaway here. Just like we would be fighting Carlos Slim and Asarco and other folks, you got to look at what the interest is. Why are people supporting this? Why are they facilitating this? I know it's easy to just say, well, we just got to vote these people out. Well, we've got to come up with strategies that will allow us to do that. We got to come up with strategies that will make it so in this state that's so heavily corrupt and captured by corporate interests, fossil fuel interests, industrial interests, that we're going to find a way to cut into their enabling electorate, their enabling base. And it's more than just a voter registration strategy. It's more than just a mobilization strategy or getting people to sign a petition. It gets back to what we started talking about with Acorn. What is their base? Where are they? What are their interests? And where does it make sense to try and make some inroads and cut away? And unfortunately, we just don't have enough of that happening in Texas. There's an effort to try to build coalitions with some social justice and some youth-focused organizations, but we're all part of that same progressive, quote-unquote, groupthink. or Democratic base that we're not actually doing much to expand other than registering some new voters. And there's a lot of unpacking that needs to happen. Why can we go talk to some steel workers or some people on the Texas-Mexico border who started to vote more for Republicans and Trump because they were worried about the Green New Deal. They were worried about losing their oil jobs. Why? I mean, to this day, we haven't made that pivot collectively as a movement, and it's hella frustrating.
Yeah. It gets back to what we were talking about earlier with, kind of the DNA of environmental justice orientation to this work. The work has to be intersectional. If you want to transition Texas, the oil capital of the world, to non-fossil fuel-based energy, you need to deal with voting rights, and you need to deal with the bad education system. You need to deal with healthcare issues. You need to deal with police brutality. It's all connected. To think that we can remove this issue of decarbonizing our energy source from all of that other, what some people see as messy stuff is delusional. It just doesn't work. It doesn't make sense, especially, it's so obvious in a place like Texas, where, what are they doing? They're just trying to suppress the vote. Like they know what the deal is. They're losing numbers. They need to disenfranchise more voters in order to maintain this system.
There's an important caveat and distinction for environmentalists, environmental justice folks, whatever. If you talk to John Beard with Port Arthur Community Action Network, he's a former steel worker. His whole pitch in Port Arthur is about youth engagement, jobs, investing in the community. He's willing to talk to the companies, things like that. It's not environmental first type of thinking. But the enviros, and you'll see this any legislative session if you pay attention, we are on the far losing side of the losers. Okay, the Democrats being the losers. Democrats in Texas carry House Bill 40, which is the ban on fracking bans. Mrs. T, Senfronia Thompson out of Houston, she authored that bill. Black Democrat, revered for her work on voting rights and reproductive justice. Enviros, we are way, way out of the mix. And so even if we got those organizations doing the work you're talking about to speak about climate change, speak about the grid, pollution, things like that, we'd still be part of that losing side. And I'm not saying we just need to be building out into red country or rural country. It's a critique of the broader progressive movement that we aren't doing enough to find people, the greater majority of people that don't participate in our process, in politics, in voting, except in, presidential elections. We are not doing enough to reach people who are just going about their lives and do not give a shit about the things that we post online about our petitions or our positions or our op-eds or whatever. That is where the fight is. We've got to draw more people in while the right wing tries to keep more people out. That's our only pathway.
What does a just transition mean to you?
It's what we've been talking about. It's a whole shift in the operating system of a community, whether it's a town of 50,000 people or a state of 25 million. Just transition means that we're taking into full consideration our triple bottom line, our health in shelter, in food, our economics, our jobs, and ability to bring income and get the things that we need, and just the land and our ecology. Just transition has to anchor that that those things are connected, in that they can't be separated. That in order for our families and our children and our neighbors and all that to have a future and have a livelihood, we need to be concerned about our air quality, concerned about our water quality, but also about the quality of their education, the access to healthy food and grocery stores. If you were to talk to people and ask them to envision what their dream society looks like, which is a hard thing for people to do nowadays, you'll hear some of these things. And just transition is the process that we take to get there. It's not about getting a worker from a fossil fuel job into a clean energy job.
Well, and speaking of that, in addition to your Beyond Coal and Just Transition work, you've done a lot of work with low-income communities of color in Austin around a whole assortment of things: illegal dumping, access to green space, community solar and solar equity, green gentrification, among a bunch of other stuff. Can you talk about gentrification and how Austin has changed in the time you've been there, and the tension that's emerged about Austin becoming one of the greenest, but also increasingly one of the least affordable cities in the country?
Yeah, it's tough. People in Austin are largely still here to just party, have fun, make money. They're really eager to do what they moved here for. Go do the cool thing in the restaurant, in the corporate soccer game and whatnot. Fine, whatever. I'm not trying to harp on people for wanting to have a good time. The problem is that there's no thread of the greater good of civil society, of trying to care for those in town that struggle and have the least. That doesn't exist here. It's lessened every year. It might be new people moving here, it might be more money here, and people being displaced. But for the most part, with gentrification, the white wealthy middle class here is strong. Median family income is close to $90,000. Qualifying for affordable housing, you can make a ton of money and still qualify for affordable housing. And the people that move in, my brother Tane Ward calls them the new pilgrims. They're not super interested in learning what was there before. They're interested in what's around them now and what might come in the future. And we do have a responsibility to make sure that we not just offer up, but press on people at the doors, at community events, cool, fun shit, barbecues and things like that, to learn what was there before they came. Sort of an onboarding into the neighborhood. And we did some of this in Montopolis, my old neighborhood that I lived before I moved to South Austin. People who I was like, man, they're never going to help us. They're just, part of that new white middle class, new pilgrim. When they learned the history of the community and the issues that were going on, we said, hell yeah, whatever I can do, from, cooking, funding, speaking, writing letters, coming to meetings, you name it, but we had to keep on them. And we had to give them a meaningful task. There is a lot of power. Gentrification sucks, but I've really tried to work with myself on not being automatically hating folks for just trying to move into a home. But you do have to challenge folks on how they behave after they've moved in. In Austin, with our urban farming and desire for new urbanism and density and things like that, the culture of I know what's best is so thick, and it's really hard to stay patient. But I try to, even when I get mad and angry and frustrated, I try to remind people of what's called the Hametz Principles for Democratic Organizing and the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond's Principles of Anti-Racism. Encourage them to read them and to do everything they can to just shut the F up and go listen to the people that they're talking about in affected communities and get a sense of where you might be able to build some common ground.
I actually wanted to spend a minute on that because, you started or you were one of the organizers who started an environmental justice group in Austin years ago, and I went to a bunch of the meetings. And I feel like that's where, we got to start hanging out a bunch for the first time. But you would always start the meetings with the HEMES principles for democratic organizing, and those came out of this meeting hosted by the Southwest Network for Environmental and Economic Justice in HEMES, New Mexico, back in the '90s. Can you talk more specifically about the principles and why they're important to the work you're doing?
So when you're thinking about undoing racism or being an anti-racist or anti-racism work, you're acknowledging that you're confronting a built system, something that's built under a false construct, race. And when you're going to combat that, there's a lot of issues to it or whatever, but the Hermes principles will help you see how do you approach people in talking about it. For example, listen, let people speak is one of the principles. Listen to the people on the ground. Don't barge in there. Don't come in with your petition and your fancy stuff or be online and be a dick. Go try to introduce yourself and get to know people. Ask questions. That's okay. People are very generous for the most part, whether they're black or brown or native or Asian or you name it. If you're able to ask questions and listen about an issue, people will likely talk. Trying to work in solidarity and mutuality is another big one for me. It's not just about like I'm here to help you, versus I'm here because our struggles are connected and intertwined. And for me and my family to be successful and get what we need, it depends on your family and your people being successful and getting what you need. How can we work together to make sure that everything we do reinforces that and that we lift each other up? A lot of things that we see is very transactional in the advocacy and activism world. Sign this and then we'll go do that for you, or we'll tell the person to do the thing and change. It's not so much what can we do to help you directly, like we talked about bills and taxes and things like that. But also we have to know that, what is it we're going to get out of it? It's not just this potential policy outcome. There's tremendous value in human relationships and in culture and community building. You're going to learn about the people in your community. You're going to learn about the history. You're going to learn, and make new friends and maybe some recipes, maybe, some new music or something. It's limitless. Humans have tremendous potential and beauty, but we rob ourselves of that by, retreating into our silos and our four walls. Hermes can give something. These are short little principles that can give people something to read and reflect on. It can be kind of abstract and theory based, but when you're advocating for change and then you look at these and you ask yourself, am I doing this? There's tremendous potential for learning and changing how we do our work.
And the Sierra Club is one of the oldest large-scale environmental groups in the world, and it's traditionally been a white organization. Its founder, John Muir, made racist remarks about Black and Indigenous people, and in 2020, the Sierra Club officially apologized for those remarks and the white supremacist roots of the organization. In Texas, with your work and your presence, I feel like you've really helped the Sierra Club evolve there where you are. And you've thrived there despite the structural and institutional challenges. Can you talk about what it's been like to come into the Sierra Club as a Chicano
sure.
Organizer and from El Paso?
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, there's a crew, first and foremost. There's a crew of brilliant and dedicated people in our team and our staff that have pressed and carried the torch for. We pushed for that, what you just talked about. So Brian Paras and Becca Hinojosa and Shane Johnson and Christopher Basaldu and Vane Ramos and Misty O'Quinn, Natalie Martinez and others of our Black, Indigenous, and persons of color caucus and our staff, and others who came before. We've pushed for these acknowledgments, and it's been tough. wonderful to be surrounded by so many rad folks right now in the staff, because I remember when that wasn't the case. Texas is unique in the Sierra Club universe because it's a chapter, and we're not the national organization, so there's a lot more room to mold and break apart and reshape things. The national organization, is a lot more difficult just by sheer size and numbers and geography. But I still remember when I was doing the Blue Green Alliance stuff and working with Sierra Club, the countless numbers of boardrooms I'd walk into, being the only brown person, and on top of that, not being a policy person or someone with an advanced degree, just an organizer. The number of years that I was described as being the rabble rouser with the bullhorn, or the one who could give a speech or something like that, not acknowledged for anything else, the critiques, the strategy, the ideas, that just recently begun to break away from that as I've been around more people and done more things. The environmental world is white, it's classist, it's racist, and it's going to take time for that to really shift. And I really just, again, admire and appreciate, not just in Sierra Club but all across the movement, the BIPOC folks and the persons of color that are holding it down and doing the work. I look at groups like Southwest Workers Union in San Antonio that have stayed on a steady course in the last few years just to look at the whole picture of just transition at community building and taking care of their people in the whole. And I'm so grateful to see that that's a thing and that they're still carrying that mantle. Our membership in Sierra Club, as most folks who know the organization would know, is older and wider, mostly male, mostly middle class and upper middle class. So to have folks with these different backgrounds and demographics working there, speaking loudly, calling for change, it inevitably causes conflict and tension. And it wasn't until a few years ago where I started some of the things I'm telling you today about building and understanding and in culture building really started to take root. Because before then, I was very similar to how I was at ASARCO on the ASARCO fight. I was like, screw you, shit or get off the pot. And that wasn't really working, And for me, the solution to the pollution, as Bobby Seale said, of this problem of racism and classism in the environmental movement, it is dilution, but it also is people's uprising and revolution. There are so many folks out there who care about the future of the land, the air, the water, and our grid in Texas. And we need to do better to afford them opportunity to be leaders in this work. There's a belief in environmental circles that I do not understand at all, that only folks who have been around for a while, who know the stuff, know the issues, can be the ones that are the leaders and the chairs and the board of directors and things like that. And that's just way off base. If we don't invest in cultivating new leadership, in letting folks have the mantle to make decisions and make mistakes, then all those folks are just going to die off and run this thing into the ground, which is happening in a lot of ways. And that's a constant struggle for me and for others in trying to get the folks who've held power in Sierra Club and environmental spaces for many times more than 20 years, be willing to let go of that power.
Well, years ago, you wrote a Facebook post that you titled Earth Day Reflection on Privilege in Environmental Justice Organizing. I just want to quote from you for a second. You wrote, "The world's a different place when you see a tower of death every day from most every part of your city. When you can run your hand across your school railing and see yellow chalk-like particulate pollution on your fingertips. When plant workers complain of excruciating pain and illness while showing you scars and tumors on their arms. I personally hold a tremendous amount of internalized anger and oppression inside my body and my heart that fuels my organizing, and, at more times than I'd like to admit, my pure hatred." While you acknowledge the importance of anger and organizing, you go on to say, But I've learned that anger only carries you so far, that without a crystal clear symbol of oppression, like an 828-foot tall smokestack, a dying husband or wife or ill child, you have to rely on more than anger to build a movement. Humans have a history of forgetting our history. We move on. So this is just a short Facebook post, but it feels like there's a lifetime of experience behind it. Can you talk a bit about what you were getting at here and how you've come to now view the relationship and tension between anger and movement building?
More often than not, our people are compelled to action in a fight or flight mode, run away or challenge without much thinking. It's our natural reaction. And it becomes more and more difficult to reflect on what caused us to take action and to think further ahead about what are we trying to actually build and do. As I've mentioned several times, we don't give people the opportunity nor the space to have those kinds of reflections and then listen to others and take that and actually use it to inform how we're going to do the work that we're setting out to do. I have a lot of guilt around the ASARCO work because, I had the opportunity to leave, and I did, and I feel like I left folks behind. Any community I've organized in, I carry guilt because, I moved on with my life. Every single one. It's a tough thing, and it's a testament to the need to leave behind infrastructure as best you can. I believe just like we need social workers and firefighters and electricians and plumbers, we need organizers available at scale to support communities in this work and in their infrastructure building and in maintenance. And without it, I think we just depend on people to do it, and that's not sustainable. And through all of that, we can look back on things. We can learn together. We can look back on what we did, our struggles, our tactics, our strategies, our demonstrations from the KKK rally to the Iraq War to Occupy, Save Our Springs, whatever, and try and find ways to share that knowledge in alignment, in spirit of the indigenous peoples of the land and the culture and the lifeways that they've carried and that we've moved away from so much. It wasn't until the water protectors work that I became involved in 2016 that I really, and my brother Tane Ward, really began to realize how much harm the anger was doing to me, spiritually and physically and mentally. It was always easy to get angry and then use that, but I found myself spread thin, people around me telling me I got to slow down. I was doing too much. I got to get some sleep. Couldn't sleep. I was drinking a whole ton, and through that work and through prayer and ceremony and time in the lodge and around the fire and in listening to various elders in the community, I was able to really, let go of some of that and still hold it, but let go of the tension and try to move towards, well, what is it I want to build in my life? What do I want to work on in my life and bring into the world? And without all of that, I wouldn't have crossed paths with my partner. We wouldn't have gone camping at the launch of a pipeline camp in West Texas and come across some sacred red-tailed hawks, a whole family of them. We wouldn't have had that trip together. We wouldn't have had our daughter and all the things that have come since.
There's an Austin American-Statesman article from 2016 that talks about you and Pete Rivera door knocking around various low-income neighborhoods of color in Austin, talking about energy efficiency. And Pete Rivera is the president of the Springdale Airport Neighborhood Association, and he's quoted in this article talking about educating low-income residents on lowering energy usage and accessing energy rebates and subsidies from the city. He says, it's just a lack of us reaching out to people where they are, actually at their homes. Nobody has gone house to house. And part of the work you and Pete are doing here is countering that classic narrative from fossil fuel interests that environmental protection and a transition to clean energy will hurt poor people. But I also just love the sentiment of this story. Let's go house to house and start conversations about these important issues. And that's what you've been talking about. It's just like true community organizing. And having known you for a long time now, I'd say that this act of walking around the neighborhood and starting conversations, which I've done with you and I've seen you do it, and learning from people and sharing your knowledge, I'd guess that that's kind of your sweet spot and where you're happiest. What do you think about that?
Going door to door in a way where you're not just like trying to get something quick and hit a certain quota of doors in a certain amount of time. Otherwise, some, aspiring politician or Politico staff member is going to get on your ass because you didn't hit it. It's wonderful, man. It's just talking, it's just being around people, getting to know, and through it all, the more tactics and cards you have up your sleeve to deploy, about talking about the houses in the neighborhood going up for sale, or the loose dog you saw, or the chickens running around, or whatever it is. You look around at, everything around you, and that's all of your material to use to chat, to get to know somebody. It's beautiful. It's authentic. And people may invite you into before the pandemic, they might invite you into their home. They might offer you some food or water, show you around. I mean, you could spend an hour in one house on one door and learn so much there. And it's just such a wonderful experience that I want as many change makers as possible to be afforded the opportunity to do that. And then to come together and talk about what that experience is like, what they learned, and then to strategize together about how do we actually, us strangers in the neighborhood that don't live there, how do we make a plan to seed the space to these folks and support them so they're the ones going around like Pete and talking to their neighbors and building some infrastructure like the Springdale Airport Neighborhood Association, and help them, supply their meetings. If we need transport to their meetings, food at their meetings, whatever it is. And, the wild part about all that work is technically it wasn't really, what I was quote unquote funded to do by the Beyond Coal campaign. I was supposed to shut down a coal plant.
Right. No, I always noticed that you always had your hands in so many different things. And I would always be like, this isn't Sierra Club work. This is like you're involved in so many different organizations and so many different people and communities. But that's what community organizing is.
That's right. And that'll be my role going forward in talking to funders and other folks about, defining the quote unquote work. I made the case and I laid it out for the coal people in Sierra Club why that strategy mattered in terms of their city council votes and the need to build a base in city council districts where we had, sometimes 10 or fewer members. We had a strategy for actually doing it successfully. And we did it in a way, John, that, in the end, we got those council members to vote against the coal plant and to vote for clean energy and all that stuff, sure. But all along the way, we were providing direct help to people in letting them know about smaller trash bin sizes that they could we could help them apply for. In some cases, they could save $30, $40 a month right then and there, or get an additional recycling bin, learn how to recycle.
That's awesome.
We helped advocate for safer routes for the kids to go to school so they wouldn't have to crawl under the train to go to school. And most visibly, most known is the cleanup of the Red Bluff Vista, 50 years of illegal dumping of oil and construction materials atop one of the most beautiful views in all of Austin. Working alongside Pete and his brothers, as we did all this, we'd talk to people about, what do you know about La Loma? What do you know about Red Bluff and the hill up there? Hungry Hill, and how do your kids get to school? And, what do you think about that new house that got built and rent and things like that? We're not talking about coal. We're not talking about solar. We're helping on things that they need and that they know. And everything that we touched around there was highly successful because it was community led. It was the concerns of the community put front and center. The only thing that we couldn't confront and that I hold some guilt around is the displacement and gentrification, because that is just a tsunami that's incredibly tough to fight back. And now we're seeing Springdale Airport be targeted for some incredibly insane redevelopment.
So we're wrapping up here. How does environmental organizing and the environmental movement need to change to quickly and effectively address the mounting ecological crises we're facing around the country and around the world? What are you seeing from Texas?
We need to acknowledge right away and be, fully clear, even with our, C3 and C4 and different funding pots, we need to acknowledge that the root of the problem here is the political system that is operated and controlled by fossil fuel and corporate interests, and is going to continue to prioritize the needs of those corporations and companies over the needs of the people, and that we need to defeat them. And then we can work backwards to figure out the strategies to defeat them. We're going to see that, we need to do as much local work in Texas as possible. Cities, towns, school districts, around some of the positive things like clean energy, like bill savings and energy efficiency. The winter storm and the grid collapse has presented us an incredible opportunity to do that kind of organizing and talk about what people can do to make sure that they don't suffer from that again, that we hold people accountable, and just continue to drive on this economic lens front and center, and build as much infrastructure as we can, but really try to tie people back to that larger reform that's needed, and do so in a way, most importantly, that is bringing in folks that generally participate politically every 4 years, or maybe don't participate politically every 4 years, focusing on those two constituencies to bring them into the fold. So when we have our local races and our state representative and senator races, that those folks are activated and they're ready to challenge any Republican or Democrat to hold the line on grid and climate and environmental justice issues. We're not doing much of that at all right now.
How has your relationship with the rest of the natural world changed since you were a kid growing up in El Paso?
I think it's oddly similar. And, like I said, my dad would get us out all the time. I talked to my daughter about how we used to, throw open the garage door and bust out the lawn chairs and watch the rain every time it happened. And more often than not, run out and grab the trash can lids and go for a ride down the curb, down the water, and make our way down to the creek or whatever the arroyos that were out there. Our time in the desert, hiking in the dry arroyos. A lot of times as a kid, I was very, I don't want to be out here, that
totally.
typical kid stuff. And now I love it. And I'd rather spend my whole day in it. I think I'm more in tune with the ecology and the impact of various things on our ecological balance, from, drought to invasive species, pollution, and of course the changing climate patterns. But more than anything, the deepest change would be something like my spiritual connection with that land. I wasn't aware of that as a child, and even just giving thanks to the pecan tree that shades my house every day, the value of that, praying to the river and giving gratitude to the cottonwood trees. It's a core part of who I am now.
So I've asked you to bring a quotation to read that's been particularly meaningful in your journey in life. Could you end the show by reading what you brought and telling the story of its significance to you?
Yeah, let me start off by reading it, and then I'll get into it. This is from Audre Lorde, radical intersectional feminist, poet and author, and it was written in the 1980s in reflection on the 1960s and Malcolm X. And the most famous part is the first line, and then I'm going to read quite a bit more from the speech afterwards. There's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. Malcolm knew this. Martin Luther King Jr. knew this. Our struggles are particular, but we are not alone. We are not perfect, but we are stronger and wiser than the sum of our errors. Black people have been here before us and survived. We can read their lives like signposts on the road and find, as Bernice Reagan so poignantly said, that each one of us is here because somebody before us did something to make it possible. To learn from their mistakes is not to lessen our debt to them, nor the hard work of becoming ourselves and effective. We lose our history so easily. What is not pre-digested for us by the New York Times or the Amsterdam News or Time Magazine, maybe because we do not listen to our poets or to our fools, maybe because we do not listen to our mamas and ourselves. When I hear the deepest truths I speak coming out of my mouth sounding like my mother's, even remembering how I fought against her, I have to reassess both our relationship as well as the sources of my knowing. Which is not to say that I have to romanticize my mother in order to appreciate what she gave me, woman, Black. We do not have to romanticize our past in order to be aware of how it seeds our present. We do not have to suffer the waste of amnesia that robs us of the lessons of the past rather than permit us to read them with pride as well as deep understanding. We know what it is to be lied to, and we know how important it is to not lie to ourselves. We are powerful because we have survived, and that is what it is all about: survival and growth. Within each one of us, there is some piece of humanness that knows we are not being served by the machine which orchestrates crisis after crisis and is grinding all our futures into dust. If we are to keep the enormity of the forces aligned against us from establishing a false hierarchy of oppression, we must school ourselves to recognize that any attack against Blacks, any attack against women, is an attack against all of us who recognize that our interests are not being served by the systems we support. Each one of us here is a link in the connection between anti-poor legislation, gay shootings, the burning of synagogues, street harassment, attacks against women, and resurgent violence against Black people. I ask myself, as well as each one of you, exactly what alteration in the particular fabric of my everyday life does this connection call for? Survival is not a theory. In what way do I contribute to the subjugation of any part of those who I define as my people? Insight must illuminate the particulars of our lives. The first line in that, the single issue lives and single issue struggle, I didn't learn about that until the House Bill 2 protests at the state capitol against Wendy Davis and abortion restrictions in Texas. And there were two young women holding a sign that had that. And that's around the same time I was going through some anti-racism training and classes, and it fit, right? Like I was carrying a sign that said something about like, we don't have to take this crap. The same people behind this are the same ones that are polluting our air, putting our kids in prison, whitewashing history, etc. And so it was exciting to learn about Audre Lorde and what was she talking about. Deeper than that is you hear in the quote, it's one, we have a responsibility, and two, we have so much that we can tap into that we ignore. And if you go on to read the whole piece, she'll get in even deeper, something that should resonate with a lot of activists around and lefties around the country, about our own infighting, about how much we do to minimize each other's identities and contributions in order to prop ourselves up or make us more of a visible or vocal authority in its space. And there's so much to unpack from this, and for me, it's part of that deeper level of power and culture shift that we need to get to. When so much of what I've talked to you about today in changes in the movement is more of like, how do we march towards that place?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what often strikes me about these brilliant thinkers and writers, and reading their work decades after it was written or said, it often strikes me how present it feels.
And not just the relevance in that way, but I mean, she's reflecting on 20 years before then. Right. And it's 40 years since she said this and wrote this.
Right.
And you have, like, I really grill into people as much as I can, reflect on the amount of time that it's taken the right wing and the corporate elites to build their power and what pushed them to. They responded to the 1960s. They responded to Nixon signing, the Clean Water Act and all those other transformative Earth Day policies. And they took their time, and they used the culture wars, the Christian conservatism and the right-wing stuff in the 1980s to build a formidable machine and base.
Yeah.
And they're reaping the benefits now.
Well, thank you so much. This has been amazing.
I'm grateful for the space and the time to, process some of these things and talk about them.
Thank you so much to Dave Cortez. Go to our website at chrysalispodcast.org, where you can find the quotation Dave read from Audre Lorde, plus book and media recommendations. This episode was researched and edited by Gabriela Corba Vivas. Music is by Daniel Rodriguez Vivas. Mixing is by Morgan Honecker. If you enjoyed my conversation with Dave, please rate and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Contact me anytime at chrysalispodcast.org, where you can also subscribe to our newsletter and support us with a donation.